welcome to the CRICKETher Weekly. I have no idea which episode it is. I barely know which day it is anymore after several nights of up all night watching the World Cup. But we're here and we're going to be talking about the World Cup later. The green screen is back with Leah Tahuhu there. We'll be talking about her later too. Who?
Oh, God.
Oh, yes, we're back.
That was really terrible.
But first of all, the Caribbean Premier League. So it was announced this week that there's going to be a Women's Caribbean Premier League, which is going to take place at the same time as the men's competition, Raf. We don't know a massive amount of details, do we? But what do we know, and why is this so exciting?
Yeah, so there's only going to be 3 teams, first of all, and so that means that it's going to be a little bit smaller than the men's competition, and potentially there's going to be some gaps between the games, because if it's going to run for the duration of the men's, then there's going to be a few less matches. But yeah, it's a little bit short on details, but I guess it's an exciting announcement. From our perspective, we're kind of sat here wondering, which overseas stars, I suppose, they might attract and how it's going to work, because it is actually going to clash with the back end of the 100. And we know that Hayley Matthews is already signed to play in this year's 100. It's possible that other West Indian stars like Dotton and Stephanie Taylor may get a 100 contract. And perhaps will then have to miss the back end of the 100, because you'd think that the Caribbean Premier League organisers will want those big names there, definitely, for the start of the competition.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think you can launch it without the big stars, and they have said they're definitely hopeful of getting overseas. I mean, stars was the word they used. But of course, it's going to happen in September, so we've already said that it's going to clash with the very back end of the 100. So, people like the top Australians will have basically signed contracts for that, and I don't think that the ECB are going to be very happy if they say, well, no, we're actually going to the Caribbean Premier League,
well, also,
even if that was realistic.
And also, it's about pay, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're going to be paid more to play in the 100 than they would to play in the CPL.
Yeah, exactly. So the big Australian stars that are going to be over here certainly not going to participate in the beginning of it. But also, it clashes with England-India, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
because
does,
England-India are scheduled to play some matches in September, aren't they?
Yeah, some ODIs and some T20s, and that will be straight after the 100 finishes, basically, with just a few days in between, which is obviously part of the attraction, because then you get the Indian players over to play in the 100, and then they can just kind of stay on afterwards. But that obviously means that none of those players will be able to go and play, because they won't be able to get those non-objection certificates from their respective boards, because they'll be having international commitments. So that leaves out a bit of a hole in terms of who we might expect to go. I suppose in terms of English players, there's obviously a tier of players who will know that they're not going to be playing in any internationals for England. They could go, but on the other hand, it also clashes with the back end of the Rachel Hayhoe Flint Trophy, our 50 over domestic competition.
Do you think the ECB would let someone like Eve Jones go? What do you think?
I think it's possible Eve Jones may be opening for England by then, given what we're going to talk about in the World Cup. But if she isn't, would the ECB let her go? I suppose it's possible. On the other hand, I think that it will come down to what the regional directors want to see, and what the regional coaches want to see. And if the schedule is such that it's going to involve more lying around on Caribbean beaches than it is actually playing cricket, and they're going to then end up missing potentially the final stages and the final of the Rachel Hayhoe Flint Trophy, then that's not going to be something that the regional staff are going to want their players to go and play in.
Yeah, and it's increasingly going to be the case for regional cricket in this country, isn't it? That the coaches and the management at the regions are going to be judged on results, so they're not going to want to lose their best players. So they're probably not unlikely to see a whack of English players either, I'd have thought. But nonetheless, good news overall. We've talked for years about when there's going to be a women's IPL. The Caribbean Premier League have beaten them to a certain extent, in terms of something that appears like a fully fledged tournament. I guess the one key thing that on the other side of that coin, Raf, is that we've seen a lot of criticism of the Women's T20 Challenge, which is sort of the Women's IPL light, on the grounds that it's not a proper tournament. It's just been a very brief, sort of 2 or 3 team affair. But in fact, that's actually, in practice, what this Caribbean Premier League thing is. So a lot of people that have been praising the Caribbean Premier League are the same people that have been criticising the Women's T20 Challenge for not being a proper league. So
it's quite different though, isn't it? Because the West Indies Cricket Board are not known to exactly be flush with cash. I think that Caribbean cricket has been struggling financially for a while now, so for them to take this opportunity to launch a women's competition feels quite progressive. Whereas, on the flip side, the BCCI have just got so much money that they don't know what to do with, and yet aren't prepared to kind of flesh out their Women's T20 Challenge into a proper, fully formed IPL. So it's perhaps the boards are coming from slightly different starting points, and that's why there's been more praise of this move than the Women's IPL.
Okay.
Yeah, so shall we talk about the thing that's been keeping us all up all night this week? Many sleepless nights. Thanks very much, England. Always making it come down to the wire. It's the World Cup, isn't it, Sid? It's week 3, something of the World Cup. The time has kind of escaped me, but anyway. So we have seen the first team this week have qualified for the semi-finals. Who else could it be other than Australia? So they have added 2 more wins to their complete set this week. The West Indies and India. The West Indies win was quite convincing. The India game, well, they did win in the end with just 3 balls to spare, so that came down to the final over, didn't it?
Well, gosh, but Raf, it was this was like the least close game that you have ever seen.
Okay.
I mean, they did take it down to the final over, but it never remotely looked in doubt that they would get over the line. I don't think the Indian players even believed that they had any chance to stop Australia. They were so obviously going to make that chase.
Okay.
They're just, and it's Lawrence Booth tweeted this week, and it was right that the World Cup is setting itself up nicely to be a frantic and close fought competition to see who has the right to be beaten by Australia in the final.
Well, yeah.
That's where it looks like it's going, isn't it?
Yeah, he knows how to sum things up well.
Totally dominant.
Editor. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's Australia. We're not going to talk too much about them because there's been so much said already, and what else is there to say other than they're playing really brilliantly?
Yep.
Okay, now Bangladesh have actually had a really exciting week at the kind of slightly other end of the table. They beat Pakistan. And they nearly beat the West Indies. West Indies have had a bit of a seesaw tournament, haven't they? In true West Indies fashion, they're beating teams they're not expected to beat, and they're nearly losing to teams that they really, according to the rankings, should be expected to beat easily. And West Indies were only chasing. Bangladesh were only chasing 141. Ended up being bowled out for 136.
Yeah, that really came down to experience. So I watched the Bangladesh innings, and they all they needed to do, particularly in the last sort of chunk of overs, was just almost just block it. If they just blocked it, the runs would have come from somewhere. There'd have been wides. There'd have been opportunities where it pinged a bit more off the block than you thought. You'd have been able to take the odd single. And it's game experience, which is the thing that hopefully they're going to get a lot more of in the next few years, and that's going to take them up to another level, because that's the one thing that's different between them and those West Indian players that had the experience to kind of bowl it out.
Okay, but it's great to see them actually competing in their first ever 50 over World Cup. Yeah,
no, and I think that it's a great prospect for longer term.
Okay, fantastic. Now South Africa have also had a pretty good week, haven't they? They're now second in the table, only Australia are ahead of them. And they've had a couple of final over thrillers. They seem to be specialising in those. They beat England in the final over by 3 wickets. And then against New Zealand it was even closer. It was only by 2 wickets in the end. They've been quite reliant on Marizanne Kapp, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels a little bit unfair to say that they've been a one-woman team, doesn't it? But they really have been. I mean, obviously, Kapp's with the ball has been brilliant, and she's really looking like a fantastic candidate for player of the tournament.
Yeah.
Which is often not a player from the winning side. It was
Correct.
last time. It was Tammy Beaumont last time.
It
but
was.
the time before that was Susie Bates, I believe.
It was Susie Bates in 2013.
Who obviously didn't get to lift the trophy that time. So I think that's looking a good bet, perhaps. But the fact is that actually she's been really important for them with the bat, and that just shouldn't be happening, right? They should have a strong enough, top order, middle order that they shouldn't be relying on Kapp to come in, But what's missing for South Africa? What's the missing X factor out?
Well, the obvious answer is Danae van Niekerk is obviously back home
Exactly.
with this injury, and I think it's been really interesting because we don't necessarily think of Van Niekerk as if we were compiling a list of the top 10 or top 5 batters in the world, top 5 bowlers in the world, we wouldn't necessarily have her in either list. But what this tournament has shown is that she's a really important kind of cog in South Africa's machine with both bat and ball.
Yeah.
Obviously, one of their issues and one of the reasons why they keep having to kind of limp over the line is that they're losing middle order wickets in clusters, and she just provides that stability in the middle order. And then with the ball, with her leg spin, not necessarily, the most kind of prolific wicket taker, but does provide an element of control that's really important.
Yeah, and exactly what they've lacked again, their spin bowling has lacked control. And if she'd been able to bowl, 10 overs in every game, which she was perfectly, able to do. So, if only she hadn't been attacked by her kitchen floor.
But South Africa are second in the table,
Yeah.
which is really exciting and not necessarily something we would have predicted. And they are one of the teams with their destiny in their own hands. So shall we talk a bit about what each of the teams now needs to do in order to reach the semi-finals?
Yeah, well, okay, so we know that Australia already qualified.
Yep.
South Africa need one more point.
Okay.
So as long as one of their games gets washed out, they don't even need to win another game, and they will definitely make the semi-finals. But another win, obviously, will put them through as well. And the West Indies also have their destiny in their own hands.
Okay.
They need 3 more points. So 2 wins or a win and a washout would be enough for them to guarantee getting through. And then, all the way back down the bottom of the table, Bangladesh actually, interestingly, also have their destiny in their own hands.
That is interesting.
It's unlikely. They've got some big games coming up, but if Bangladesh win their 3 remaining games, they will definitely qualify for the semi-finals.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it's totally wide open then, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and in terms of at the bottom of the table, of course, Pakistan even aren't out of it yet. Technically, Pakistan and New Zealand could actually still qualify.
Okay, because we're going to talk about New Zealand and England in a minute, but there was a bit of talk about whether New Zealand are mathematically out of it. Now they're kind of all but out of it, but as alongside Pakistan, they could still reach.
Yeah,
the
there's a couple of strings of results that could lead to them being able to qualify on net run rate.
Okay.
So, possible.
So New Zealand are going to be hoping for some kind of big upsets this week in between established teams. Okay, interesting. Now, there's 2 teams that we haven't talked about yet, India and England, and I understand that they are in a reasonably similar position in terms of what they need to do to qualify. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. So they'll both be obviously wanting to win their last 2 games. If they both do so, that will put them both level on 8 points. So that means it comes down to net run rate between the 2 of them. And I wrote a piece on CRICKETher this morning detailing exactly how this kind of pans out. It's also possible that South Africa or the West Indies might also be level on the same number of points, but they're unlikely to be able to make up the net run rate deficit. So it looks like it's going to be between England and India. And what could be really exciting is that last game. So India will have one big advantage. They will go into the last game, which is the last game of the group stages against South Africa, knowing exactly what they need to do. Okay. So they will know going into perhaps the final innings, perhaps they'll be batting last. They will be able to do the calculations in the lunch break and go, okay, we need to score 220 runs in 33 overs to qualify. And if it takes us 34 overs, then England qualify instead. So England also will be watching that game potentially very nervously, or potentially just cheering on South Africa, of course.
But India won't need to do those calculations because you will have done them. All they need to do is look at Twitter.
Yeah. They're not allowed to look at Twitter during the game, though, Raf.
So, Mitali and Harmanpreet follow at CRICKETher. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. ICC, anti-corruption regs and all of that. Okay, yeah. Well, maybe you could send them a letter or a telegram instead, or an email. Okay. I don't know why I went with letter. It will reach them in approximately a week after they get eliminated. for not knowing what they need to do. Okay, so that's what all of the teams need to do. But let's now talk about the kind of elephant in the room from our perspective, which is the performance of England, who, after all, are apparently, so they tell us, the defending champions. They may not be. What are you doing?
Well, it's not been pretty, has it, Raf?
That's a bit of an understatement. So they lost that narrow match to South Africa that we've already talked about. They did manage to beat India, but they bowled India out for 136, and then they kind of sort of stumbled across the line, nearly making a complete mess of it. Yes, thank you.
Well, the thing was that we looked at that game and we thought, oh god, that was far too close for comfort.
We did.
And then today,
against New Zealand.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
New Zealand with literally with 4 hands tied behind their backs.
I think the word literally is doing some quite heavy lifting in that sentence. But they obviously were kind of lacking two of their big name players, weren't they, in the end?
Yeah, so Sophie Devine went down with. She initially started clutching her hip, and it was back spasms.
Right.
The way that your nerves work in your back, I know this. I don't know much about physiology, but I do know this one.
Okay.
That the nerves in your hip are sort of get reflective pain if you get a back injury, so it can feel like the pain's in your hip.
Your nerve
so that's
connected
why.
to your backbone.
Exactly. So that's why she went down clutching her hip, even though it was back spasms. She did come back to bat a bit more, but then. Obviously, she didn't look comfortable, did she?
No,
As you said in your Guardian report, and then she didn't come out to field or to bowl. And it's just like England took advantage of that situation because New Zealand really needed those options, didn't they? And then, of course, Leah Tahuhu also went down after only bowling half her overs.
Yeah.
And that made things even worse for New Zealand. So, that's what I meant by having 2 hands tied behind their backs. And yet, somehow... England still managed to nearly England it all up. It's
ridiculous, isn't it? I was sat there kind of yelling expletives at the television.
Yeah, the neighbours here didn't have to wait for their copy of The Guardian to be delivered to know Raf's opinion on what was going on.
Yeah, sorry folks. It was just excruciating to watch. And in particular, that run out, the Catherine Brunt run out, coming back for a second run. At that stage in the game, they did not need to take any risks. They could have just,
There was so many balls left.
Singles, yeah. And so it was really irresponsible of her to do that. She's basically the most senior player in the team. This is her millionth World Cup. That's a slight exaggeration, but not too much.
Not much of one.
And to be honest, it followed on from a pretty poor performance by her with the ball at either end of the New Zealand innings. She let them get away to a flyer by bowling some absolute crap full tosses and wides up top. And adding to England's ridiculous tally of wides in the tournament.
How many runs they conceded in wides now?
I know this because I calculated it for the Guardian piece. 69 runs in wides. So they're topping the wides tally in the tournament. Yay! And then at the back end of the New Zealand innings as well, they were able to hit her for a couple of boundaries off what ended up being the last over because they were bowled out. She did take the final wicket, or was the final wicket a run out? Okay. Wicket. But anyway...
She's only taken 1 wicket in the entire tournament against Australia.
Well, there you go, and has conceded a lot of runs. And it was just a very difficult performance to watch and frustrating. And actually, one of the frustrating things about it is that England have now played a very similar team for all of their matches in this tournament. And they don't, whenever they get asked about it, they just seem to shrug and go, well, of course we're going to keep playing these players. It doesn't matter. It almost doesn't seem to matter how badly players are performing. They're still going to get selected. And that's really quite poor. If I look at, for example, the fact that Charlie Dean didn't get an opportunity to play in the opening 2 matches because, doesn't seem to be one of the kind of favoured few who's an automatic selection no matter what she does. And she's actually been one of the few England players to emerge from this tournament with any credit to date. Obviously was really instrumental in that match against South Africa, taking 4 wickets. Against India, taking 4 wickets, and then took a couple of
more today.
Yeah, a couple more today, and so you know, that's great to see. But it does kind of underline that England, I think, have got a bit of an issue with some of their selections, which are being made on established position. It feels like, really, and kind of almost. Seniority, rather than who could actually do us the job and who could do a better job and not send down a ridiculous number of wides every match. So that was very difficult.
Yeah,
to
and
watch.
the batting hasn't been quite firing either. And even Nat Siver's been in good form in some ways, and she's got some good numbers. But the trouble is she's not closing things out, and that's becoming a problem, I'm afraid. And
I liked
if England,
what you said in the CRICKETher piece about they are the tail. They should not have to be doing this.
Yeah, because Nat shouldn't be. It's great that she's scoring these runs, but she shouldn't be leaving Catherine Brunt and Charlie Dean and Anya Shrubsole to try and close out the game. She should be doing it herself. And it's feels like the 3rd or 4th time that's happened, where she's got a reasonably big score in the last couple of months. Including the Ashes. Because it's kind of what happened in the Test as well, isn't it? They didn't, they got England into the position, and then they left at the end of the day, Crossy having to block out 6 balls.
Yeah, that's true.
At the end of that.
Yeah, it did feel a little bit like that.
It's so similar. So.
And what concerns me is I listened in on the Kate Cross press conference afterwards, and there was a lot of smiles, there was a lot of laughter. It's kind of a sense of relief. But almost a sense of, shrug, we got across the line and that's all that matters. It's not all that matters. It really isn't. And you just think that England are potentially quite likely now to scrape through to the semi-finals and claim that position, and then possibly in that semi-final match they might then get across the line because it's just one more win to get under their belts, and then they get to the final and they're just going to end up papering over the cracks. They've been really poor this tournament. They do not deserve to reach the semi-finals, and I don't say that lightly, because that team is full of people who I know a bit, who I respect, who I like, but they've just been playing really poorly, and to just shrug it off and go, oh well, we got over the line so it doesn't matter, is really not the right attitude, I don't think.
Yeah. Anyway, well, this time next week, we will be looking back on what's certain to be quite an exciting week, if one that perhaps makes your heart beat a bit faster than God designed it to do.
More sleepless nights, Sid.
Yeah. But we'll be back here to either do the post-mortem or to look forward to England's participation in the knockout stages. Same time, same place next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.